"You're not raising a baby under this roof." That's what my father said. No yelling, no second chances. He just placed my old red duffel bag by the door like a package being returned. 9 years later, the son they erased became the doctor who saved my mother's life, and they had no idea it was him. I've lived through the cold silence of being erased by my own family. I raised a boy alone, with nothing but a blanket and a name picked in the dark. And somehow, that boy chose compassion over revenge. If you stay with me for the next few minutes, I'll show you how I rebuilt my life from a bus stop to a warm kitchen, and what my son taught me about grace, forgiveness, and quiet strength. Because when my mother whispered, "He has kind eyes," not knowing who he was, I realized sometimes the full circle doesn't need permission to close. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, don't scroll. This might be the story that helps you breathe again. Before we dive into the story, if you're enjoying these meaningful stories, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on more. Now let's start the story together. He didn't yell. That made it worse. He just got up from the table, walked down the hallway, and came back holding my old red duffel bag. The same one I used for track meets in middle school. He set it down by the door like it was a package being returned. Then he looked at me, looked through me, and said, "You're not raising a baby under this roof." It was meatloaf night. Tuesday. The carrots were overboiled like always. The porch light outside kept blinking even though he'd changed the bulb twice last week. Mom sat across from me, still holding her spoon in midair. She hadn't even taken a bite when I said the words, "I'm pregnant." 3 syllables and she froze, didn't speak, didn't move, just let the spoon fall into the gravy with a soft splash. Dad didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw anything. That tone, flat, even, unshakable, was the same one he used when he went out to kill snakes that sometimes curled in the garden shed. Cold, clean, final. No one asked who the father was. No one asked if I was okay. I took my coat, the one with a busted zipper, and pulled it tight. My shoes weren't made for January, canvas sneakers soaked through with half-melted snow. Mom pressed a napkin into my hand as I passed her, eyes still not meeting mine. On it was a name and an address. Ruth W., her mother, my grandmother, the one I'd only met twice, the one Dad said was no example. I walked 5 blocks in the freezing dark. My breath came out in puffs, small ghosts against the Indiana sky. My fingers were stiff, my legs numb. I kept one hand on my stomach, not for warmth, but as a promise. I was still here. I was still carrying something that mattered. The Greyhound station smelled like coffee and bleach. I paid the fare, $23 in crumpled bills, and waited beside a vending machine that had eaten its last dollar years ago. There was a man sleeping on a bench and a woman yelling at her phone. I didn't look at either. The bus pulled in just after midnight. The driver didn't ask questions. I rode with my head against the cold window, the hum of tires on wet pavement the only lullaby I had. I didn't sleep. Just watched the signs blur past. Towns I'd never stop in, lives I'd never lead. By dawn, I was standing in front of a pale yellow house with chipped shutters and an American flag above the door. I hesitated. I didn't know if she'd remember me. I didn't know if I was welcome. Before I could knock, the door opened. Ruth stood there in a thick robe, her silver hair wild like the morning itself. "You're early," she said, not surprised. Her voice wasn't warm or cold, just real, like she'd been expecting me somehow. I stepped inside. I didn't say a word. The tea kettle was already whistling. Ruth didn't ask if I was okay. She made a turkey sandwich with mustard, cut it diagonally, and set it on a paper towel. Then she laid a quilt across the couch, not saying a word, just like I was a soldier come home from somewhere no one wanted to talk about. I didn't speak for the first day. On the second, I slept in shifts, waking up to the hum of the crock pot, falling asleep to the soft rustle of Ruth turning pages in her recliner. Her house smelled like clean sheets and cinnamon, like time had folded in on itself and left me in a place where no one expected anything from me except to just be. She didn't hover. She didn't press. But she did refill the teacup near my pillow before I noticed it was empty. On the third morning, I opened my eyes to sunlight pooling on the linoleum floor and the steady sound of her humming. I didn't recognize the song. I didn't need to. I breathed in and didn't feel like I was choking anymore. Later that week, she took me to the clinic in town. It was a small building next to a thrift store with faded posters and a fake ficus plant in the corner. The nurse asked questions gently. Ruth sat in the hallway with her knitting bag, legs crossed at the ankle. Inside the exam room, I watched the monitor as Dr. Patel found the heartbeat. It was fast like a hummingbird's wings, and impossibly strong. I didn't cry. I just stared at the screen like it was the only thing holding me in one piece. When we got home, Ruth didn't say anything. She just opened a tin of oatmeal cookies and pushed one toward me. I took it. She resumed knitting, something with deep green yarn, her hands moving like she'd known how forever. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered into the kitchen and found a mason jar in the back of the cabinet. I washed it, dried it, and wrote "Future" on the front with a piece of masking tape. The next day, Ruth let me help her at the church bake sale. Someone gave me $1 tip for boxing up extra brownies. I folded it slowly and dropped it into the jar. A few weeks later, the trees were blooming and the air had shifted. I caught myself humming while folding laundry. There was a moment, just one, where I looked in the mirror and didn't see a failure. I saw someone. Starting over. One afternoon, Ruth handed me a small bundle wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a baby blanket, light blue, soft, with tiny white stitching. "Started it back in February," she said, not looking up. "Didn't know if you'd come, but I figured, just in case." I held it in my lap. My throat tightened, but I didn't speak. That night, after the house had settled into its quiet, I sat on the edge of my bed and whispered into the dark. I was thinking, if it's a boy, maybe Caleb? From the hallway, Ruth's voice came, soft and certain. "That's a good name." My first job didn't come with much, just a key, a space heater that wheezed, and coffee that tasted like old pennies. But I could lock the door at night, and that felt like luxury. Mel's Diner sat right where the road curled past the feed store. It had cracked booths and a flickering "open" sign, but it didn't judge. I started off spilling more drinks than I served, but no one seemed to mind, least of all Mel, who handed me a rag and said, "Just smile while you mop." One day in early spring, I spilled coffee right down the front of a man's gray suit. I was sure he'd snap. Instead, he grinned and said, "Vintage charm. Adds character." He left a $10 tip on a $5 bill. He came back the next week, and the next, always sitting in the same booth by the window, always reading the same battered paperback. He never flirted, never even asked my name. But he started leaving books instead of tips. Kids' books, mostly. One day, he handed me The Secret Life of Dragonflies. He mentioned wings, the man said, nodding toward Caleb, who was perched on a stool with jelly on his chin. Caleb was 3 now, full of questions. "Do clouds walk?" he asked one afternoon. I didn't know what to say, but Ruth whispered, "They wander, honey, like prayers." At the library, he stacked books taller than himself. At home, he built towers from toothpicks and raisins. Ruth taught him how to make cinnamon toast, burnt edges but full of love. I kept dropping coins in the future jar. Every quarter felt like defiance. One evening, the man, his name was Adam, I learned, asked if he could sponsor Caleb for a weekend science camp. I froze. It sounded too neat, too generous. "I appreciate the offer," I said stiffly, "but we don't take charity." That night, while folding laundry, Ruth looked up and said, "Don't punish the boy because the man's decent." So I said yes, quietly. Caleb left the next Saturday with a backpack too big for his shoulders and a dragonfly drawn on the front pocket. As the bus pulled away, I whispered, "Be bold, baby." Adam stood beside me. He didn't speak, just brushed my shoulder with the back of his hand, barely there. And somehow, in that silence, I felt seen. Not saved, not claimed, just seen. You don't think about legacy when you're scraping dishes or folding laundry at 2 a.m. But I did. Every night, while I sprayed down counters at the dental office and collected stray paper towels from under sinks, I thought about Caleb's future. Not the vague kind, the concrete, world-changing kind. He deserved more than just enough. By 2019, Caleb had memorized every bone in the human body and could build cell structures out of cereal boxes and cotton balls. He taped diagrams above his bed. Ruth would ask questions she already knew the answer to, just to hear him explain. Ruth had slowed by then. Her hands shook while pouring tea, but she never asked for help. I noticed more naps, more time in the chair by the window. She once said, "It's not what you leave behind, it's who you teach to keep going." I didn't realize she meant it literally. I picked up a second job cleaning offices. Nights blurred into mornings, and I learned to nap when Caleb was at school. I kept our small home clean, our fridge full, our lights on. Adam, still gentle and still quiet, would drop by with leftover casseroles or fix the leaky sink without fanfare. Once he offered to pay the electricity bill during a snowstorm. I told him no. He didn't push. Then one morning in February, the house was too quiet. I found Ruth in her rocker, eyes closed, hands folded around her rosary. The tea kettle was cold. There were no gasps or final words, just a stillness so profound it made the walls feel smaller. We buried her on a windy hill just outside town. A simple service, no flowers from my parents, no letters. I held Caleb's hand the entire time, but the truth is, he held me. Weeks passed. I kept working. Caleb kept building. This time, an application packet with essays and lab reports and recommendation letters. He didn't tell me he'd applied. Just said, "I want to do something that matters." The envelope came on a Tuesday. Heavy cardstock, gold lettering, full scholarship to Johns Hopkins. I stared at the acceptance letter, then at him, my boy with knobby elbows and oversized dreams. "I didn't want you to carry it alone," he said, standing in the doorway in his too big hoodie. "You didn't," I whispered. "You carried me too." And somehow, in that moment, I understood what Ruth had meant all along. Grace isn't about what you earn. It's about who keeps walking beside you, even when the road is uphill. Some dates circle the calendar like blood in water. You don't mark them. You feel them coming. That Tuesday came for me again, 9 years later. It had been raining all afternoon in Baltimore. I was stirring stew, window cracked just enough to hear the soft patter on the sill, when my phone buzzed. Caleb's name lit up. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and answered. His voice was low, controlled, but I knew something had shaken him. "Mom, we had a rush case. Woman in her 60s, cardiac. It was tight. She's stable now, but..." He hesitated. "Her husband came in today. Brought cookies for the staff. Said his wife kept saying I had kind eyes." I smiled faintly, thinking of Caleb's soft way of speaking. Then he said it. "Their last name is Weller." I stopped stirring. The smell of rosemary and beef hung heavy in the air. My fingers tightened around the wooden spoon. From the doorway, Adam watched, brow furrowed, but he didn't speak. "I didn't know, Mom," Caleb whispered. "I swear." "I know," I said. "It's not on you." The next day, I told Adam to set 2 more places at the table. It wasn't until dusk that the knock came. Caleb opened the door. Richard stood there first, older, slower, with deep grooves carved into his face like cracked bark. Behind him, Susan, pale and thinner than I remembered, holding her purse with both hands like it might anchor her. Adam didn't say a word, just stepped back. I poured tea, the good kind from Ruth's old tin. "You wanted to meet the woman who raised him," I said, my voice steady. "Turns out you already knew her." No one spoke for a long moment. Caleb looked between us, a child again, though he was taller than his grandfather now. Susan opened her mouth but closed it again. Her hands trembled as she reached for her teacup. I noticed the faint line on her wrist where the IV had been. Caleb had saved her life, not knowing the blood in her veins once turned cold when she heard his name. Richard cleared his throat. "We didn't know how to reach you. We didn't know how to apologize." I nodded once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. "There's no clean line back to the beginning," I said softly. "But you're here now. I don't know what that means." Caleb set down his cup. "It means we sit, we drink tea, and maybe we try." The silence that followed was not cold, just careful. Adam placed another log in the fire. Susan finally looked at me. "You did right by him," she whispered. "Better than we ever did by you." I didn't respond. Some things don't need a reply. I looked toward the shelf where Caleb's kindergarten photo still stood, buck teeth, gap-toothed smile, a paper stethoscope around his neck. The storm had passed. The house was warm. The tea was still steeping. And for once, Tuesday didn't feel like a curse. It felt like a reckoning. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. They had written a story where I vanished, where I didn't survive the winter, the silence, or the shame. But I had. And now they sat on my couch, beneath the photograph of the boy they never came looking for. The evening had settled into that quiet place between daylight and dark, where the kettle's hum sounded louder than words. Richard shifted in his chair. Susan sat with her purse still clutched on her lap. Adam stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, arms folded but gentle. He wasn't part of this chapter, but he'd lived every page with me. Susan placed a sealed envelope on the coffee table. Her hands trembled as she slid it across. "I wrote this after Caleb was born," she said. "I never sent it." I didn't touch the envelope. "I don't need words on paper," I said. "The truth already arrived." Richard cleared his throat. "What do you want from us?" I looked at Caleb, who was watching us all like he had too many hearts to protect and not enough hands to hold them. "Nothing," I replied. "I already have what you thought I'd never build." Caleb sat forward, elbows on knees, voice tight. "If I forgive them," he asked, "would that hurt you?" I met his eyes. "No, but don't call them family. Not yet." He nodded slowly. The room fell still again. Richard looked down at his shoes. "Can we come back someday?" "I don't make promises I can't keep," I said. The conversation ended there. No big scene, no raised voices or redemptive speeches, just the quiet understanding that some wounds don't scar over neatly. When they stood to leave, I handed them a paper bag, stew and cornbread still warm. Susan blinked at it, confused. "For the road," I said simply. They stepped into the drizzle, shadows stretching across the porch. Adam locked the door behind them, then returned to the sink without a word. I didn't read the letter. I tucked it into the drawer beside the stove, behind the measuring spoons and loose recipes Ruth had written on old envelopes. Outside, the rain tapped steady on the window panes, the rhythm older than memory. Caleb stood next to me, tall now, shoulders broad, still my boy. He looked at me like he finally saw the whole picture. And as I rinsed the teacups, I said, mostly to myself, "They told the story like I vanished. But I never left. I lived." I didn't open the letter that night, but I didn't throw it away either. Sometimes what we don't say still shapes the air between us. Family isn't just who shares your blood. It's who stays when life breaks you open and helps you gather the pieces. Forgiveness doesn't always arrive with a hug. Sometimes it comes with a quiet seat at the table and the grace to keep breathing. In a world that often forgets people like Ruth, like me, it's love in action that leaves the real legacy. If this story touched something in you, I invite you to share your thoughts, or simply pass it on to someone who may need to hear it today.